Okay, hi everyone. This is Justin here at the Kansas Socialist Book Club. Our recording for our group study of Rosa Luxemburg, Reform or Revolution. This week we'll be covering chapters 2 and 3. And as you can see, we have a slideshow here, right? So this is the first slide. I'm going to read the quote and then we can discuss it. Credit is precisely in view of that what was stated above. The specific means that make this contradiction being between the capacity of extension, the tendency of production to increase, and the restricted consumption capacity of the market break out as often as possible. At the first symptom of the crisis, credit melts away. It abandons exchange where it would still be found indispensable, and it reduces to a minimum the consumption capacity of the market. That's on the physical text, pages 453 to 454, right? So this can be kind of confusing. So I want to open it up and see what does everyone like. Why do you think that this is true? Or more generally, what does she mean by this?
I'm 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 unsure.
Okay, so basically, Luxemburg says that credit has two main functions, right? To facilitate, to extend production. In other words, to serve as like fronting money to be used as capital, right? And then facilitating exchange. So in other words, helping people, consumers, buy commodities, right? And she further says, when the inner tendency of capitalist production to extend boundlessly strikes against the restricted dimensions of private property, credit appears as a means of surmounting these limits. So let me think of an example. Say you want to go buy a car, right? And I think a car costs like what, $30,000, give or take, on average. Does anyone here have $30,000 they can just produce out of their bank to go buy a car?
I wish.
Nope.
I wish too, right? So what do most people usually do when they go to buy a car?
Go
How do
on
they pay
debt.
for it?
Get
They
in
go
debt.
in debt. Mm-hmm. Exactly, right? A house is another example.
Student loans.
Student loans, right? Any other? There's one more I can think of that's more modern example that wouldn't be in this book. Very important though.
Credit cards?
Yeah, credit cards, exactly. Credit cards, student loans, auto loans, and mortgages, right? Those are the big four. Did I miss any?
No, I think that's about all the main examples.
Okay.
There's more.
Yeah, in terms
but
of consumer debt.
I guess there's payday loans now even.
Yeah.
Yes. Those are
Payday
not
loans
good.
are basically credit cards.
No, it's more like a legalized taking a loan from the mob. They charge like a ridiculous interest rate, and the idea is to get you like
Just
trapped
like
into
a
taking
credit
them.
card.
Very predatory. Very
Yes.
predatory.
It's really serving the same function as like a credit card, just even more sketchy and usurious.
Yeah.
But it is important to note here that when she's talking about credit mostly, she's talking about, for the most part, industrial credit, credit traded in between capitalists rather than consumer credit, because like commercial, widely available credit was not a thing until in the 50s, 60s even. It wasn't like limited situations, but the explosion that we see of debt being a thing that everyone has is very recent. This is not what she was referring to in this book.
Right. That's a good point, Sam. I was bringing it up so we could get to that. Because the other thing, as you correctly identified, was the other function of credit, which is between businesses, right? Like I take a loan to start a business, right? And that's what she's referring to in this book. She couldn't have possibly known what a credit card was because this was like 1900. There didn't exist back then. But given what she said here in this quote on the screen, I want to know, like, what does everyone think about, like in light of what Sam just said about consumer credit being a new thing? I guess, how does what she say here, in particular about the first symptom of the crisis, credit melts away? How does that apply to today, in particular with these consumer credit?
One thing I thought about when reading this quote and another like similar quote that happens like a page or so later is that recently, to at least as the main line of as at least what the Fed tells us, to deal with inflation, we've got to raise these interest rates. Well, if you look at how that's affected the housing market, it's driven prices down because suddenly people have less access to credit with which to purchase a house. But what that's led to materially is a huge drop off in the construction of new housing because it's now harder to finance that construction of new housing. So while there is like a material need, like we're in a housing crisis right now, there's a material need to construct more housing. The manipulation of credit at the first symptom of a crisis, the inflation that they're trying to deal with, the credit has melted away, slashing new house starts to like, I forget if it's 60% or 50% of what they were a year or two ago. So it's like reducing that consumptive capacity of the market, the construction of new houses to a...
Yeah. That's very similar to what Luxemburg is talking about. It's the same kind of dynamic with businesses, right? Because in a crisis, when prices, when things start going, the economy starts tanking, and businesses start failing and going out of business and declaring bankruptcy, they can't pay back their loans, and that has ripple effects. I think that's what she's trying to say here, in regards to like credit melts away. And part of that, like John said, was decreasing the demand for construction. It has all kinds of ripple effects, right? But it's like Sam said, since it expanded into the consumer realm. Look at 2008, right? With the whole basically it was like the most severe depression since the Great Depression, right? And what was the cause of that? It has to do with mortgages, right? Consumer debt. And as soon as people couldn't start paying, they were not able to pay their mortgages, that same sort of ripple effect spread and almost like collapsed the global financial markets. I think that's what she was trying to say here. Does anyone else have any thoughts about that?
I take it even more recently of the COVID outbreak with the PPP loans. When all these small businesses were taking these newer loans, they had no intentions of paying them back, and then laid off, many of these workers. It's credit, as she says, credit eliminates the remaining rigidity of capitalist relationship. With this type of credit, these businesses weren't able to go or didn't go under because of, this extension or this lifeline that they're able to take out. It's another form of putting more money into the pockets of these, credit lenders or capitalists, as we say.
Anyone else? Or any comments on this slide?
Is everybody up to speed on the connection between the more consumer side of things we're talking about and the industrial side of things? Or would anybody like me to try to give a metaphor to connect the two?
Could you give a metaphor?
Okay, so relating this to the whole discussion of buying a house, think about Elon Musk a couple of years ago wanting to start the production of the Model 3 Tesla car in his factories. His company was pretty small at that point. They didn't have the money, the factories, the workers employed, the machinery inside of it, the supply chains, to crank out 500,000 or 1 million cars a year. He had to on credit take loans, sell stock to other owners of capital to enable him to do this. Now that led to problems a lot in his production. Tesla almost shut down multiple times because these debt bills and credit bills came due. And if Tesla had shut down, that would have been the credit melting away crisis aspect of things. His enterprise would have crumbled. But he managed to keep it just barely afloat. But that is him using credit. And then in recessions, you'll hear pundits often talking about like it being hard for businesses to get loans. And that is that credit melting away. Elon Musk in a recession can't find somebody willing to loan him $5 billion to build a new Tesla making. Nobody's willing to loan the money because everybody's too scared. So I don't know if that helps connect the two at all.
Yeah, I think so, definitely. And then just remember, with every creditor, that means there's a lender, right? So in addition to the creditors not being able to expand, the people who lent them the money also aren't getting paid. And then they, in turn, can't, use that money as capital. So that's like the ripple effect, right?
This
You've
is
got the terms
predatory.
mixed up.
The lender is the creditor. The person who took the
Oh.
loan out is the debtor.
Yeah, my bad. I mixed the words up.
All
but
good.
yeah. Cool. I'm gonna go to the next slide. Someone want to read that one?
I'll read it. Okay. Credit is precisely in view of what was stated above, the specific means that makes this contradiction between the capacity of extension, the tendency of production to increase, and the restricted consumption capacity of the market break out as often as possible. And then it says, why is this the case? Can you think of some examples from history? And the next one is, at the first symptom of the crisis, credit melts away. It abandons exchange where it would still be found indispensable, and it reduces to a minimum the consumption capacity of the market. What does Luxemburg mean by this? Can you put it in your own words? Can you think of any historical examples of this phenomenon?
I think we kind of covered that on the last slide. We're bringing up the mortgage crisis. Are there any other ones anyone can think of?
The one I've got written down. Let's see if I can find where I wrote it down. But the dot-com bubble came to mind for me, because it was, all of this credit extended, all these loans to companies that were developing this new technology, and then companies started failing, so other debt started getting called in to cover those losses, yada yada yada. It snowballed, and so then there's a overall contraction of the market of exchange of credit. So the circulation of credit goes down. So there's not enough capital to consume at the same rate as before, even though the needs have not changed and have actually grown. And so you had companies that were making good products. You had I don't remember what it was, but that went under. And so the stopping of the exchange of credit is itself reducing the consumption ability, despite the capacity not changing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Anyone else?
The capacity of consumption, but it does not reduce the necessity of consumption. That's what I meant.
This is kind of the opposite phenomenon, but I think it's interesting. In the 2020, immediate wake of the pandemic, maybe between March and October, initially we did see so at the first symptom of a crisis, which this crisis wasn't a credit brought on crisis. This was a pandemic coming and shutting down large parts of the economy. So it was an external crisis. But credit initially did melt away, and nobody wanted to make big business loans. And so we saw the government step in, and the government meaning not only the legislative body, but also the Federal Reserve and all of that just the whole governmental system. But it stepped in and made massive amounts of credit available to try to avoid this tendency that Luxemburg talks about. So I think it's interesting not only to look at where this does happen, but also where it doesn't happen, because her whole point in discussing this is to look at the means of adaptation of the capitalist system to its crises. And so we just saw one of those means of adaptation and it has led to a huge inflation and a cost of living crisis that the ruling class is still struggling to get a handle on. If you look at just, first of all, the detrimental economic effects of it and the growing civil unrest due to those actions.
And
Right.
I'd like to mention that so they are infusing the market with huge sums of money, and this can cause inflation to some extent. But to control this, they have to take money out of the market. And the way that they do that is by raising interest rates, so that all the banks that get money from the Fed they have to pay back more, and they will also issue more. What are they called?
Bonds.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
yes, exactly. And for example, the Hungarian state is issuing bonds that have a return of like 4% above inflation. And if you think about that, that's a good investment. But this means that later on, state has to put more money to the market. So in a sense, it's gonna make the crisis last longer.
So it's almost like the state intervened and produced credit where there shouldn't have been credit, and now is trying to withdraw credit where there should be credit by raising interest rates.
hmm Yeah, I think that pretty well sums it up. I'm going to go to the next slide here. So, who wants to read this one?
I'll read it. Okay. We see that credit, instead of benign, an instrument for the suppression or the attenuation of cruises, is
Oh,
on.
I misspelled that. My bad.
Okay. Attenuation of crisis is, on the contrary, a particular mighty instrument for the formation of crisis. It cannot be anything else. It constitutes the technical means of making available to an entrepreneur the capital of other owners. It leads to speculation. Credit not only aggravates the crisis, it also helps to bring and extend the crisis by transforming all exchange into an extremely complex and artificial mechanism that, having a minimum of metallic money as a real base, is easily disarranged at the slightest occasion. Since 1970s, the global market operates on fiat money, i.e., there is no precious metal backing currency values. Given Luxemburg's analysis, what can we say about our own time and how it differs from the early 20th century? What new contradictions arise from this material change?
Okay, so not to sound like a Ron Paul gold standard person, but it's directly relevant here because as she says, he talks about like them in the 1900s they still had their money tied to precious metals, right? Every country did, and then Bretton Woods came along and they fixed the rate of exchange, and then I think it was the 70s when they just got rid of it and everyone pegs their stuff to the dollar, right? More or less is what happened. But there's nothing really backing the value of the dollar other than the government saying, hey, we'll pay treasury bonds, right? That's pretty much all there is for it. So that's kind of, I shared a link about Bretton Woods. I hope everyone read it if you don't already know about it because it explains a lot about what's going on. But can anyone think about how that's affected and led to different crises and any comments about that?
Well, when you said that, like, the dollar isn't really backed by anything, it is backed by, like, actual resources and, like, labor in the economy. Like, that is what backs, like, the dollar.
Let me think. So When we had precious metals backing the dollar, in other words, I think what I was trying to say here was there was a limit to how much credit could be extended by the central bank.
Yeah. But now
which-
it's like it's much more free, because like for every dollar that's put into the economy, you don't have to like chip off like 0.2 grams of gold for every dollar there is. So you don't have to like have like selling gold off, and then eventually you'll run out of gold, so then you won't be able to just like give off credit anymore. So now it releases that constraint. The fiat currency releases that constraint by making it solely based on the resources and the labor.
Funny thing is that when someone owns gold, it's usually stored at a certain location. They don't have the actual gold bar. And they will have to pay some fees for storage. And that's done not by chipping off some piece of gold from the gold bar, but by artificially creating more gold on paper. So that's going to be more gold than what actually exists.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So they're kind of like counterfeiting it with saying that they have gold that they don't really have.
Yeah, but as long as everyone keeps the gold at the same place, it doesn't matter.
I just want to add to this real quick before we start discussing the quote more fully. The relation between like what money is and like how that relates to both gold and fiat currencies is something that Marx dives pretty deeply into in the first few chapters of Capital. But the gist of what he explains is that the value in money is the value that money is expressing is the value of the exchange that money is mediating. So like our entire economy today is mediated in the dollar. And so the dollar, while it's not quote unquote tied to anything, is tied to all of that economic activity. Back in the day when we had a gold standard, it was the amount of money you would get paid for your labor was tied to physical gold in the amount of gold that could be produced by that amount of labor in the amount of time you spent laboring. And so the gold standard provided like a limit on the size of the economy, like the size of the pie that you could split up. And so if you wanted to add 50% more laborers to the economy, but you didn't have 50% more gold, weird deflationary things would happen. Whereas by decoupling the economy from the gold standard, now, I'm not going to say the government because it's a lot more complicated than that, but we as a society have some control over that money supply and can thus manipulate it, exacerbating credit crises a lot because we can now even expand beyond the physical boundaries of the economy in regards to labor power production, whereas before we were constrained by the physical amount of gold on the earth. But like there still is a value, an underlying value being expressed in dollars. It's not fake value.
Right. Yeah, I was just trying to say it. The gold being tied to gold is like restricts the propagation of credit. Is the point I was trying to make.
Yeah.
And like Sam said earlier, I just want to say, Sam said, when Luxemburg wrote this, there wasn't credit cards or consumer credit like there is today, which is absolutely true. I would just say I think there's a relationship between decoupling from the gold standard and the propagation of consumer credit, which, as we discussed, just makes all the contradictions that Luxemburg points out 10 times worse because the credit has expanded, right? That was the point I wanted to get at with this.
I would push back a tiny bit. Consumer credit didn't exist in the form that it does today, but if you read accounts of the condition of the working class throughout the 1850s and on, you see many instances of like common practices being workers purchasing bread on credit from a baker to be repaid at the end of the week when they got their wages, or rent being paid on credit, and various other things. So there wasn't a comprehensive credit system, but the proletariat in general was being subjected to a kind of credit card, payday loan kind of credit scheme, and being further exploited in that way at the lowest strata.
If you guys want to like learn more about like fiat money, like credit in the modern day, you guys should learn modern monetary theory, MMT.
I've heard of that before. I have to look into that more. But I think the fact that like John, what you said is absolutely true, but it's also like you said that was like individual credit to individual merchants, whereas now everything runs through banks, right? So it's all been like centralized and all that capital's been concentrated. And in that way, I think again it makes the contradictions that Luxemburg points out that much worse, because now instead of like, let's say I default on my payday loan from the butcher, right? Then that butcher might go out of business, but it's not super systemic thing. Whereas if everyone defaults on their credit cards that are all centrally managed through Visa, then it's like, that's a lot worse because they lend out their money to other people and stuff. You see what that's the point I was trying to make.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I'm thinking that if everyone starts eating some cheap food like oatmeal per whole month and not spend money on expensive things, then the economy might collapse because of this.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very good point, because so often the advice
these
given to
companies
working
wouldn't be
class
able to.
But like, if everybody saved, then I think you're right. The economy would collapse.
And these businesses suddenly wouldn't have an income, and they would have to make do with what money they have on hand already, and pay credit with that money, and pay wages with that money too. But once they run out of money, so what?
I want to go on to anyone have any more comments before we go on the next slide?
I do have one final thought on this
Uh-huh.
quote, because I thought it was a really interesting quote.
Mm-hmm.
But specifically where she says, by transforming all exchange into an extremely complex and artificial mechanism, like credit makes the simple process of exchange. You know, I make this and sell this to you. That's exchange at a very simple level. Credit makes it this immensely complicated system. You could talk to so many people who work in finance, and they could talk to you all day about all the complexities they deal with in what, at the end of the day, is the distribution of money to affect production. And so you hear so many apologists for capitalism say, oh, but like if we got rid of capitalism and the credit system, like how would we like organize production? Like if you just immediately canceled all loans in existence, everything would collapse. And it's like, well, no, the material basis for production would still exist if you canceled every loan in existence right now. All of the factories, all of the workers that work in those factories, all of the raw materials that are transformed in them still exist, and with the proper system of organization can still be put into motion, even if you got rid of the credit system. But it's just this complexifying artificial mechanism that gets itself so entrenched into the methods of production that it contributes to the capitalist realism we read about a couple months ago.
It's almost like creditors are the central planners of capitalism.
It is exactly like that. Read Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism by Vladimir Lenin.
So this one says, through the suppression of competition in a given branch of production, distribution of the massive profits realized on the market is influenced in such a manner that there is increase of the share going to this branch of industry. Such organization of the field can increase the rate of profit in one branch of industry at the expense of the other. John, you mentioned imperialism, the highest form of capitalism, and this is exactly what he talks about in that book. And the industry becomes so concentrated and the markets are so saturated that, like, the traditional growth we think of is impossible, and instead these firms aren't fighting over who's going to grow more, they're just trying to divvy up the share of the market that already exists. So I wanted to ask, what do people think are some contemporary examples of this from today, and how does this shape international politics?
So with the growth not being possible, growth becoming impossible, like no new markets to expand into, we see them create new markets, actually, like crypto or the metaverse, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is an invented market. So
Okay, that's a fair point.
That is being used to kind of delay this internal fighting over share, because they're trying to make it expand more. They're inventing new ways to expand that weren't there before.
Mm-hmm.
That's just something I noticed. So
that's a good point. I actually didn't think of that one. Before I give the example I was thinking of, I want to see if anyone else has an example. Okay, look at what's going on in Ukraine, right? It's about many things, right? But one of the main things that the United States is indirectly fighting Russia over is the share of the European natural gas market, right? That's why That's why the Nord Stream pipeline got blown up, because then it cuts off Europe's access to Russian oil or natural gas. Oh, well, guess who you got to buy it from? Now you got to buy it from the United States.
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking of when I wrote this.
Yeah, because and someone told me that, like, the World Economic Forum told, like, Canada and the Netherlands that they need to cut like 100 or like 50% of their food production, and that's just going to make them more reliant on like exports from the United States, which grows a lot of food. So then it like the destruction of their productive capacity makes it so that it makes it so that the countries that lower their productive capacity need to be reliant on another, which is more, has a bigger productive capacity in another way.
Do you recall the reason they gave for that? Like, I'm curious what their pronounced reason that Canada and the Netherlands should grow less food.
Because it was supposedly because of like pollution, which is a bullshit reason, because like there's tons of other things which I'm pretty sure which are way more, like, cause way more pollution than like cutting your food production capacity. But that was the supposed reason.
Yeah, let's grow all the food in the U.S. and ship it across the ocean to the Netherlands, because that will cause way less pollution.
Yeah, but because the thing is, that's what Justin was saying. The Nord Stream pipeline was blown up, so then now it's all about, like, the war is all about the United States capturing Europe as its market. That's what the whole conflict with Russia and like the United States and Ukraine and just in general is about. They want to capture Europe as a good little market that will only be reliant on the United States and won't be like trading partners with anyone else but them.
Richard Wolff, in a recent podcast, referred to Europe as a, quote, beautiful little plum to be fought over by like the U.S. and then whatever sort of a potential China-led, but whatever countries choose to align with them. But I just thought that was so funny, like a beautiful sweet plum.
Yeah, but that's exactly, to the capitalists. It is a plum. They think it's great because You know, whether it's food or natural gas or whatever, they'll do whatever just because then that market share goes to them. That's the point. That's how I interpreted this quote. I'm gonna go to the next one.
And
go ahead.
with relation to food and international competition, like I want to bring up South Korea because I tried to Google it and uh, let me read this. The U.S. Food Surplus Aid under Public Law 480, the Agricultural Trade Development and Assistance Act of 1954, caused a steep fall in grain prices. As a result, farmers lost the incentive to produce, and the agricultural production base began collapsing. Because the internal market was saturated by cheaper foreign grain and other agricultural goods.
Yeah, like I think that something like that happened in like some African countries, like some organization from the United States will just keep like giving cheap grain to certain like African countries, which destroys their internal markets, which like their own markets that create their own grain. So it ends up like destroying their like markets.
Yes, that's Thomas Sankara talked about that. He had a quote where I don't remember the exact quote. I wish I knew it, but he talks about that exact thing about how, oh, if you want to help Africa develop, don't just give us, food as an act of charity. Come give us the tools. Come spread the knowledge so that we can sustain ourselves. Because that is one of the ways that in neocolonialism that they keep people dependent on them.
It's a form of imperialism. It's the United States uses like food as a very important source of some of its imperialist policies by like IMF loans and like in World Bank loans or.
And I know, for example, this isn't food related, but in Swaziland, right? They were telling me about how Swaziland has a shit ton of garment and textile manufacturers, right? So in Swaziland, they create they create shirts or whatever. But the thing is, they're not allowed to wear the shirts that are manufactured in Swaziland because of the laws of the country set up by the king. The shirts have to be shipped out, usually to either Taiwan or South Africa, and then maybe they like put a Nike logo on it or some shit. And then they ship it back to Swaziland and elsewhere in the world where they charge an incredible markup for intellectual property, and then the Swazis can buy it. So it's although it's not food, it's the exact same dynamic that I think relates to this.
Yeah.
Since then, I found some actual numbers, and as of 2020, Korea's grain self-sufficiency rate was 20.2%, meaning that the grain that they consume, they produce 20.2% of that, and they have to import the rest. And the general food self-sufficiency rate was 45.8%.
All right, I'm going to go on to the next slide here. Let's see. I think this is a really important one, right? So all this stuff about credit's cool, but why does everyone think that Luxemburg went out of her way to spend the entire chapter talking about credit and monetary policy?
Because it helps build her point against the guy in the first chapter.
Bernstein?
Yeah, it helps build like her point, and like it helps like further build her point against.
How so?
Him. Well, because it provides like it lets you see that some of the idealism that Bernstein has about like reformism within an environment where it is that things work in the way that they do, it's not possible. I don't think I'm explaining it that well.
No, I think I got it. I just does anyone else have any comments about that?
I guess to phrase what Sam was saying, like she's making the point credit is not going to be what saves us and leads to socialism. Credit is hurting us.
Mm-hmm.
Does that align with what you were saying, Sam?
Yeah. The Bernstein makes the argument in his writings that credit is among the means of adaptation of capital that will eventually transform it into socialism, and that's one of his main points. And so she dedicates this time to disproving that because it's a main focus of his argument, and so that's why she's focusing so much time on this.
Okay. I think it's still good to understand it, though, because, well, a lot of people do make silly arguments that have been hashed out in history, but just to my knowledge, I have not heard any socialists in the United States try to argue that credit will be our salvation. I could be wrong, though.
No, even among reformist social democracy, Bernstein's theories of credit have largely gone to the wayside, from what I can tell.
I think it's still important to understand the dynamics of it and like the contradictions, though, because as we discussed, it still plays out to this day, just in a different way. I think we answered the rest of these questions. Does anyone else have any comments about Chapter 2? I'm trying to be respectful of the time here. Okay. All right. Chapter 3. So this says, according to Conrad Schmidt, quote, this one's about unions and trade unionism, and this is a good one, too, that I think is more directly applicable to today. So according to Conrad Schmidt, the trade union struggle for hours and wages and the political struggle for reforms will lead to a progressively more extensive control over the conditions of production, and, quote, as the rights of the capitalist proprietor will be diminished through legislation, he will be reduced in time to the role of a simple administrator. The capitalist will see his property lose more and more value until finally the direction and administration of exploitation will be taken from him entirely. Therefore, Schmidt argues trade unions, social reforms, and as Bernstein, the political democratization of the state, are the means of the progressive realization of socialism. That's on page 465, right? Now, she answers some of these questions later on, but I think going into it, keep in mind, like, why is she taking a critical stance of trade unionism here, right? Because perfect example, and I mean no disrespect to anyone when I say this, but I think it's directly applicable here. A lot of people are like, oh, Starbucks unions are going to be like the salvation of socialism, which I'm not trying to insult any workers or anything, and I think it is great that people are getting organized. But at the same time, like fighting over wages and hours and material issues like that, as she talks about later in this chapter, it's good to raise people's consciousness, but as she argues, it's not enough. And I think we see that a lot with people in the DSA in particular who try to do, they call it like the rank and file strategy, where they try and like target a particular business and like try and organize it from within. And again, I'm not saying organizing unions is bad, but as we discuss this more, we'll see it's not enough. Does anyone have any comments about that or anything to add to that?
I mean, if we think about it, unionization and things like that isn't really getting towards the root of, anything at all. It doesn't change the exploitation or, anything inherent to the capitalism or the capitalist system. It's just a way to regulate the exploitation of workers, that by increasing wages or, getting more working days off, as we're seeing a push to four-day work weeks and stuff like that. It doesn't change the exploitation that is at the root of capitalism itself. Nothing against, like you said, unionization, until these unions are ran or organized by Marxists themselves. It's just another way to salve the wounds of capitalism.
I also think it's helpful here to contrast trade unionism with industrial unionism, which I don't believe she mentions that in the chapter, but it's a very important distinction. Does anyone know what the difference is?
Can you tell us the difference?
Yeah, okay. So trade unionism, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe trade unionism is like when you try to focus on like a specific business, like let's say Starbucks, for example, um, as opposed to industrial unionism, which to use the Starbucks metaphor would be, let's organize the entire chain of production of the coffee industry from the retail point of sale to the bean growers in the third world who are being hyper exploited and harvesting the beans, right? I think the IWW, Industrial Workers of the World, it's the approach that they take, for example. Sam, I know you know a lot about this. Do you have any comments?
An industrial union is like you said, it's like let's change like the social relation of how it is that um things are produced, whereas a trade union, they fight for like changes for wages, changes for like, but they're not. But a trade union isn't gonna try and do what an industrial union does.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay. So a trade union is usually a very specific, it's a trade, right? So it is bricklayers or it is uh, pipe workers, people that do a very specific thing. And so it's organizing those workers, but not necessarily the whole business, the whole industry. Um, an industrial union, on the other hand, is everybody, like you're saying, everyone involved. Even in just one, you could have an industrial union that covers one business, but if it covers all levels of that business, that would still be an industrial union. The difference is whether you are fighting for one specific group of workers or all workers. Trade unions are specific, industrial are general for the most part.
Yeah, and an example of that is I think is the AFL-CIO, for example, during the Vietnam War, was very much in favor of American imperialism in that war. One, because they thought, oh, well, this war is a great way to get jobs in the arms manufacturing industry for our union members, right? So they had that form of chauvinism going on. And also, it's like Sam said, they weren't thinking about all of the workers, and so they weren't thinking about having solidarity internationally with the Vietnamese workers, right?
Yeah.
That's another way that this chauvinism manifests. Yeah. Any other?
So like so essentially, it's like trade unions or like unions in general should be more militant or should participate in like the purpose of a union should be directly for the purpose of like of waging a class struggle.
Yes.
So the argument that Rosa makes is that the trade union inherently cannot be a vehicle for that class struggle. It can only be reaction to the whims of the bosses. That's the umbrage she takes with the trade union specifically.
Yes, this is, I got some more quotes here that I think illustrate what Sam just said. Does anyone want to read them?
I'll read it. Okay. The interests of the capitalist agrees with the progress and development of capitalist economy. It is his own interest that pushes him to make technical improvements, but the isolated worker finds himself in a decidedly different position. Each technical transformation contradicts his interests. It aggravates his helpless situation by depreciating the value of his labor power and rendering his work more intense, more monotonous, and more difficult. What are some modern examples of this? What are the social consequences of this? What are its implications for class struggle? And the next one is, what does the active participation of trade unions in fixing the scale and cost of production amount to? It amounts to a cartel of the workers and entrepreneurs in a common stand against the consumer and especially rival entrepreneurs. Basically, we no longer have a struggle between labor and capital, but the solidarity of capital and labor against the total consumers. What does Luxemburg mean by the effort of labor unions to fix the scale of production and the prices of commodities? What are some examples of this today? Why does she argue that this effort represents a so-called solidarity between labor and capital?
think
I've got
that,
a good one for the first question.
Oh, go ahead.
So, back when I worked at UPS and was part of the union there, I remember getting a couple texts about a Kansas House bill that was being passed to allow the testing of autonomous trucks on Kansas roads. And the UPS union, they were like against this, and they're saying this is like, contact your representative, tell them to vote against this because this is going to like take away our jobs basically, which like, yes, under the current system, autonomous trucking technology would take away a ton of good paying jobs at UPS right now. But that contradiction that Luxemburg is talking about is like self-driving trucks just in isolation, just imagining the technology, have the potential to do so much good, like free up so much human time to pursue other things that you no longer have to spend behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler driving down the highway. But because of the system we've set up, that the advent of that technology is going to put millions of people out of work. And so the UPS union rationally is trying to fight against that progress in material technology.
AI is another one too. Like it's the big debate. And again, John, it's like you said, some of this AI stuff has really like literally life-saving applications. For example, AI image recognition can diagnose cancer from X-rays and MRI scans better than a medical doctor can, by like a couple percents. So again, it's like you said, it has good applications, but how does it end up getting used under capitalism? Well, now, I don't know, Disney can just AI generate some art, and then they don't have to pay the graphic design team, and they can save more money that way, putting the artists out of work, right? That's the example I was thinking of with the first quote.
It really reminds me of the Luddite movement.
Yes.
Which is, I think, what Rosa's kind of talking about, without mentioning it explicitly.
Yes, I agree with that. The Luddites were the people who they saw that like the machines were replacing jobs in the factory, so they kind of what do you say, like spoke out and sometimes even destroyed the machines because it was.
If you ever heard about the London tailors smashing sewing machines, that was the Luddite.
Yep.
So,
and then the capitalist argument is, oh well, it's better for everyone because it's this great new technology, but they always gloss over the fact that the way this technology is applied under capitalism has a very large human cost to it.
So, on a more broad view, the way that trade unions operate, in that they are essentially agreements between, cooperation between labor and capital, agreements to cooperate in a certain way, that means that they will inherently be dragged into supporting stuff like imperialism, because those wages, those benefits must come from the boss's accumulation of wealth. So that's why that it will impede the class struggle to have strong trade unionism in an economy, in an imperialist economy, because the wages in an imperialist economy come necessarily off the backs of labor in the global south. And so fighting for a bigger cut of that means that you need to fight for more of that exploitation, which means that it will be inherently opposed to the socialist transformation.
So basically, in an imperialist country, the labor unions are reactionary, essentially.
They have to be, in order to achieve their goals of worker protections, worker rights. They have to be reactionary to maintain those rights. It is not a knock against them necessarily. It's just a matter of how everything works in the imperialist system.
Yeah. I mean, I understand that, but I don't like believe that that's because the workers themselves are bad people. Like, you could like want higher wages like within the United States and be in a labor union, but I think that also at the same time, like, you could be in a labor union and then you can understand like that the imperialism that this country does, that it's I mean I'm not sure if like, I mean, because I'm pretty sure that labor unions, they can be like a good, or they like the building of labor unions, that should be an important part of like awakening class consciousness.
It can be, but ultimately their goals will, in the end, the goals of a labor union, of a trade union in an imperialist society, within an imperialist society that does not seek to transform the imperialist society, will run antithetical to
that's
world transformation.
understandable. So that's why, like, you know, earlier someone said that like that labor unions should be ran by like Marxists. Like, you know, of course, if it is that a labor union isn't ran by people that are like class consciousness and that are ideologically like well educated, then I mean, then it's not going to be militant. It's going to, they're not going to understand what the purpose of what they're doing is.
I think that's what Sam is saying, as well as Rosa. I mean, the labor unions kind of hinder the transformation of society. You know, the part of the labor union is to limit reform, just the fight in defense of, you know, better wages, and then eventually capitalists will go on to find different markets, like Sam was saying, to try to make up the gains that they've lost from these labor unions.
So there is a work, a good, I don't remember if it was like a pamphlet or an essay by the Italian left communist Onorato Damon, who, you know, I'm not huge on left communism, but it's a very enlightening read on how, you know, the use of a union, of a labor union in imperialist society can only go so far, and it ultimately can't be a vehicle for socialist revolution.
Yeah,
and we should.
I'll find it and I'll link it later.
We shouldn't be hindering labor unions by any means. We're just saying that labor unions only go so far.
Yeah, because if you read this, Luxemburg never, I don't think she's ever wrote like, oh, labor union, your trade unions are evil or anything like that. She's just saying structurally, like, they cannot. It's like trying to mix oil and water. Like, it's just the dynamics of the dialectics of it. It doesn't mix. You know what I mean?
And that's why I was saying that until labor unions are ran by Marxists and are militant, they're going to only go so far. I mean, it's great to see these unions, the Starbucks unions and whatnot, but they're not making any structural change for, you know, society.
Right. Yeah, to use the Starbucks example, like I said earlier, an example of an industrial unionism and a radical unionism that Luxemburg would approve of would be as if, in addition to requesting better wages for themselves, they also advocated on behalf of the coffee pickers in the global south. Or think of the Amazon union, right? In addition to advocating for the raising of wages of Amazon workers in the United States, what about the Amazon workers in India and South Africa who are just hyper exploited? You know what I mean?
I think Chris Smalls has big plans there, but he needs to get himself an officially recognized union in New York City before he can move on. That.
Oh yeah, no, I'm not trying. Again, I'm not passing judgment. I'm just making an example statement.
I did have two thoughts from this discussion y'all have been having. One being that, like, a labor union in a Starbucks, for instance, is solidarity, but exercised on a very small scale. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the emergence of the original communist movements back a couple hundred years ago, it was small trade unions would form, and then members of those unions would go meet each other and realize, hey, all of us in this city don't like what's going on. Let's all work together and liberate the workers in this city. And then people in other cities heard about the kind of stirrings going on, and then they started to meet up, and that's how you end up with the first Communist International and people actually meeting and forming worldwide solidarity. So it's like a scale of solidarity. If the worker imagines themselves in solidarity only with the other workers at their Starbucks, they may support an imperialist policy. But once you can then take that, the labor unionizing energy today, and kind of guide people towards, hey, you don't just have solidarity with the other Starbucks workers or even the other workers in the US. You're just like all the other workers in the whole world. That's where you can like ignite that class consciousness.
So basically, like when it comes to a trade union, like the way how it is to make it more militant is for the movement itself to build, because then it can branch out, and then the unions of other unions will unite with other unions, and then other people will hear about it, and then there will be like a mass movement. So like on a tiny level, on a little level, like just an isolated union will be susceptible, will not understand its role, which is to what it should be to make a revolutionary socialist movement, but it will only be to improve the situation for the workers whom are working there, but not for other people whom are also within the line of the company within other countries, which will still be exploited and who themselves don't have a union. So the way how it is to make it more militant is to build the union up, but in order for that to happen, there should be like an ideologically educated person, like a Marxist, whom leads the unions in order for that to happen.
Almost like we have this discussion book club for Kansas right here, and it's almost as if like there's a broader purpose to these types of groups, right? To educate the most advanced elements of the working class to go forth into trade unions and stuff and raise the consciousness. But also, I just wanted to say, keep in mind that this, reform or revolution is also a polemic against Bernstein's theory of reformism. So I think it's important to keep in mind that's the context that she's saying everything in.
Yeah, that's understandable, because if it is that you're just advocating for like unions in a vacuum, I think like Bernstein does, that just leads down to like the only like the workers like isolated situation improves, but the situation for workers within other countries could get proceedingly worse. So then, that's where it is. So Luxemburg comes in and says, okay, no, there needs to be like, it needs to be militant and revolutionary.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think you're also correct in that, like, I don't know, I'm a software developer, so I would look like a real goofball if I just went into the Starbucks workers, like, hey, everybody, you're doing this wrong. Like, you're absolutely right. It has to come from the rank and file of their own conscious development. Yeah, I wanted to move to the next quote here because I thought this one was really insightful, and still true to this day. She says, even within the effective boundaries of its activity, the trade union movement cannot spread in the unlimited way claimed for it by theory of adaptation. On the contrary, we see that we are not moving towards an epoch marked by a victorious development of trade unions, but rather a time when the hardships of labor unions will increase. And I just picked that one out because, like, boy, that's, like, that is a textbook description of the United States today.
I mean,
although it's starting to change.
I mean, but essentially, like, could that describe what we were just talking about?
Mm-hmm. I kind of interpret it as Luxemburg saying, like, look, not only is this structurally impossible, but, like, any gains that these trade unions win, if they don't take up a more militant platform, they might have these gains for a decade or two, but as we saw with, like, Ronald Reagan and the air traffic controllers, they're all going to get rolled back.
It's just like, it's just trade unions in a vacuum cannot accomplish anything.
Yes.
I mean, she goes on saying, when Bernstein asked if there is more or less for socialism and labor protection laws, we can assure him that in the best of labor protective laws, there is no more social there is no more socialism than in a municipal ordinance regulating the clearance of streets or the lighting of the street lamps. I mean, it's just these are just short-term gains that will just be rolled back. Even just these state protections or in the interest of the capitalists, they'll slowly roll these protections back. Like where we see them, like you're saying, Ronald Reagan rolling back many welfare programs, stuff like that. It's a push and pull. It's the classic contradictions that we see in our life.
I thought another pretty solid quote from this chapter about this was this is kind of a long one, so bear with me. But the trade union struggle will become doubly difficult. In the first place, the objective conjuncture of the market will be less favorable to the sellers of labor power because the demand for labor power will increase at a slower rate and labor supply more rapidly than at present. This is talking in the context of the falling rate of profit. In the second place, the capitalists themselves, in order to make up for the losses suffered on the world market, will make an even greater effort than at present to reduce the wage part of the total product going to the workers in the form of wages. Which, if that isn't a better prediction and summary of the neoliberal era, then I don't know what is.
She was a visionary, as Justin
80 years
said.
before Reagan.
She was a visionary.
Wait, what if Reagan read Luxemburg and that's where he got his ideas?
You would be surprised. There are like internal communications from, I want to say, Madeleine Albright, directly referencing Lenin to justify the Gulf War, the first Gulf War. They're like, you'd be surprised at how much the ruling class in America cites Marxist works specifically to use them against the goals of those Marxist authors.
I do find it interesting when reading certain like economists or like, business people talking about something. Occasionally you'll be reading something from one of them and it's like, this person has definitely read Marx, but understands themselves as a bourgeoisie and is using Marx's analysis for their own purposes. But like you can sometimes tell when a pundit like, oh, they have a conception of this. They just do not have my class interest at heart.
Not just pundits, but there's an economist. I wish I could find his name because I saw it a couple years ago. He works for the World Bank, and he basically takes Marx and is like, yeah, everything this guy says about the labor theory of value and commodity exchange and all that is absolutely true. But instead of, and we're also going to use it for class struggle, just like John said, we're going to use it to make more profits. It's kind of like he has the secret unlocked. They're just using it for the opposite purpose.
Some of the most successful businessmen in post-Soviet, post-collapse Eastern Bloc were party officials who had years and years of schooling on Marxism. And they used that knowledge to further, their bourgeois interests.
Engels owned a factory. Also, there's a guy named Armand Hammer, Arm & Hammer Bacon Soda, named after him. He was another example, but he actually used his money to subsidize the Soviet Union and stuff.
Yeah, so Engels, he helped Marx.
Oh, he did, yeah. He was kind of like his ATM.
Well, he was also his editor, and the thing is that he compiled volumes 2 and volumes 3 and I think also volume 4 of Capital from notes that Marx wrote.
Yes, he did. I wasn't trying to knock on him or anything. I was just saying he owned a business and he knew how to manage it.
The thing about what I wanted to say was that the thing is that a lot of people who are right wing, they think that Karl Marx and the things by Marxists are just appeals to moralism and appeals to this weird idea that a lot of right-wing people have. But the thing is that you don't have to be like a worker to read Marx and get something of value out of it. Like that's the thing. It's scientific, and it's extremely like Marx's analysis is extremely intricate, and there's a lot of value out of it. But of course, I mean, it comes from wanting like the class struggle of the workers to perpetuate, but it is absolutely not like this Jordan Peterson postmodernist garbage that like people like him say it is.
I think you're preaching the choir here.
Yeah.
But for the interest of time,
Oh, yeah.
just to wrap things up, is there any like final thoughts that anyone has on chapter 2 or 3?
Very informative study room, very informative reading.
Yeah, no, I think most of this book is very informative. All books that we choose to read in our discussion groups are informative. But how did everyone like the format with the presentation?
I like it. I really like
Yeah, I think it made it a lot more productive.
the thing is
I was gonna
about
say-
the thing is about presentations is that you have something to reference and go back and look at, and something that like people who are watching can watch and look at while it is they're listening to you, so then they don't just have to remember like what you said earlier. Like they can always look at the presentation, and it's something to go back and reference, which I really like, and also I think helps with people who are watching, and also the
What were you
people
gonna
who are
say,
talking.
Martin?
No, I was just gonna say I absolutely agree. And then with Justin's like all his links and everything he's been adding, appreciate that.
Oh, yeah, no problem. And if anyone wants to add, I'm not trying to like monopolize the presentation, so if anyone wants to add anything to it, you are more than welcome to. It's for everybody to contribute to. I just kind of did it because I was like, well, let me get it started. And
Yeah, no,
feel
so
free to contribute.
I was thinking for this week, I was just going to test it out with the 4 admins that we have, but I think I'll open it up everyone in the future to add any quotes.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it was a good discussion group this week. We'll get it uploaded to YouTube, and I'll post the slides themselves in one of the channels here.
I think this was a good length, too, so if we could try and keep it around this length. I mean, we've been a little bit over an hour, but it wasn't bad.
Yeah, trying to keep each session around an hour-ish.
Yeah, I can be a little long-winded, my bad.
No, you're fine. I mean, that's the point of discussion groups.
So yeah, and I'm still recording right now.
I will edit it out in the future when I'm done. I'll post another one to me. Let me actually do that right now. What are we thinking? 2 chapters again for next week? Was this a good amount of reading for everyone?
Yeah.
I thought it was good.
Yeah. We'll read chapters 4 and 5 then for next week.
Cool. All right, I gotta go make my kids dinner. So, everyone, thanks for showing up. Have a good rest of your Sunday.
Oh, and I dropped that
Yeah.
link for the Damon in the study chat there.
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
Yeah, have a good one.
Peace.
Bye, guys.